Knotek, or Shelly, appeared to lead a charmed life. She had a caring husband by her side and was raising her three daughters in her home in rural Raymond, Washington. The couple were known for their selflessness and invited struggling friends and relatives to live with them. But then those guests began to disappear. The first person to vanish while in her care was her old friend, Kathy Loreno. They had lived together in the home for 5 years before she disappeared in 1994. She reassured everyone who asked of Kathy that she had simply started a new life elsewhere. She said this when two other people vanished from her home as well. Finally, her three daughters came forward to tell the tale. All three of them had been physically abused by their parents, and their house guests had been killed. They said Shelley had starved, drugged, and tortured her victims, forced her guests to jump off the roof, drenched their open wounds in bleach, and made them drink urine. Shelley was soon caught and sent to prison in 2004. She served just 18 years before being released in November 2022, leaving her daughters terrified about what could happen next. Shelley was born on April 15, 1954, never straying far away from her hometown of Raymond. She was the oldest of three siblings. Along with this, Sharon had gotten involved in a dangerous lifestyle, with some family members believing she may have been a prostitute. The house was far from stable. When Shelley was 6, their mother seemingly abandoned them. Rather than caring for her younger brothers, she tormented them. The children then went to live with their father, Les Watson, and his new wife, Laura Stallings. Shelley didn't care for Laura and frequently told her stepmother how much she hated her. When Shelley was 13, her mother died. As Les described, she was living with a man at the time. They were homeless, drunks, living on Skid Row. She was beaten to death. Laura said she had never heard Shelley ask of her mother. Instead, she continued to torment her brothers, blaming them for missing homework or picking frequent fights. It didn't help that her brother Paul couldn't control his impulses and lacked social skills. Her older brother Chuck never spoke for himself. Shelley did the talking. But it went beyond mere childhood bickering, Laura said later. She used to chop up bits of glass and put them in the bottom of the kids' boots and shoes. I mean, what kind of person does that? In March 1969, Shelley was 14 years old and she showed what she was truly capable of. She didn't come home from school one day, and Laura and Les were panicking and they called the school. They were then told that she was at a juvenile detention centre. Their worst fears coming true, but this would only be the start. She wasn't in any trouble. She was being cared for because she had accused her father of the worst crime, the crime of rape. Laura discovered a copy of True Confessions in her room with the headline of, "I was raped at 15 by my dad." A doctor's examination later confirmed Laura's suspicions that Shelley had lied. She was taken to multiple sessions with a psychologist, both on her own and with her family, but they weren't successful. Shelley refused to accept that she was anything but innocent. Eventually, she was sent to live with her grandparents on Laura's side, but she continued to try and ruin the lives of everyone around her. Her tantrums continued. She offered to babysit the neighbours' children, only to barricade them in their rooms with heavy furniture. She even falsely accused her grandfather of abuse. Her pattern of manipulation and abuse continued into adulthood through 2 marriages and the birth of 2 daughters, Nikki and Sammy, and all the way up to 1982 when she met a construction worker and Navy veteran named David Knotek. 5 years later, in 87, they got married, and the next year Shelley welcomed her first victim into their home. Her first victim moved into the home in 1988. He was her 13-year-old nephew, Shane Watson. Shane's father was a member of a biker gang, and he was in jail. His mother was destitute and was unable to take care of him, so Shelley came to their rescue and took him in. Almost immediately, the torture began. She dubbed her style of reprimanding him as wallowing, which she employed for things as negligible as going to the bathroom without asking. It involved ordering the boy and her daughters to stand outside naked in the cold while she dumped water on him. Shelley took additional pleasure in humiliating her eldest daughters, Nikki and Sammy, by ordering them to give her handfuls of their pubic hair. Their wallowing frequently included being caged in a dog kennel. She even shoved Nikki's head through a glass door. She would then blame her, saying, "Look what you made me do." The only person in the home that she didn't torture at the time was her infant daughter, but sadly, that would soon change. Meanwhile, she forced Shane and Nikki to dance nakedly together as she laughed. After torturing her children and nephew, she would drop love bombs of utter affection on them. In December 88, a few months after Shane had moved into the home, Shelley opened the door for another person in need. This would be Kathy Loreno, an old friend who had just lost her job. She greeted her longtime friend as she greeted most people in her life, with warmth and positivity. But Kathy would soon discover, as many others had before, that her mask comes off rather quickly. Kathy became another one of her victims, but she had nowhere else to go, so she doubled down to performing forced labour naked, being fed nightly sedatives, and sleeping next to the basement boiler. Then in 1994, Shelley raised the stakes of the torture she could give. By this time, Kathy had lost more than 100 pounds. Her body was covered in bruises, cuts, and sores. After one particular brutal beating, she was left unconscious in the basement. Shelley was gone, but David heard guttural noises coming from the laundry room. He found Kathy choking on her own vomit, her eyes rolling back into her head. So he flipped her onto her side, started scooping the vomit out of her mouth with his fingers. But it was no good. After minutes of CPR, there was no denying that Kathy Loreno was dead. David recalled that he should have called 911, but with everything that had been going on, he didn't want the cops there. He didn't want Shelley to get into trouble or the kids to go through that trauma. When Shelley found out about Kathy's death, she convinced David and her kids that they would be incarcerated if they told anyone. At his wife's command, David burned Kathy's corpse, and together he and Shelley scattered the ashes. If anyone asked, she simply explained that Kathy had run off with her lover. Shane, however, recognised what the house held, the horrors, and that's why in February 95 he made a plan to get out. He had taken photos of Kathy while she was still alive, malnourished and beaten, living in a cold basement next to the radiator. He showed Nikki the photos and told her his plan. He was going to show the police. But Nikki was absolutely terrified of what might happen, and so she decided that it was a good thing to tell her mother. In retaliation, she commanded David to shoot her nephew in the head, and he obliged. Again, they burned Shane's body in their yard and scattered his ashes over the water. Sammy says the reason her mum was able to control David was because he was very weak. He had no backbone. He could have married someone else and had a very happy life, but that couldn't happen. Before the end, Shelley took one more victim, her own friend, Ron Woodworth, who moved into her home in 1999. He was a 57-year-old gay veteran with a drug problem, an ugly lowlife, Shelley called him, who could use a steady diet of pills and beatings to get his life together. She didn't allow him to use the bathroom, so he was forced to go outside. In 2002, Shelley took over the care of James McClintock, an 81-year-old retired merchant crewman who had reportedly willed her his $140,000 estate once his sister died. Perhaps it was coincident, but maybe not. But James died from a head wound he allegedly suffered from falling in his home. Police, however, were never able to link this death to Shelley. Back at the house, Shelley demanded that Ron cut ties with his family, then forced him to drink his own urine, and then ordered him to jump off the roof. He didn't die from the 2-story fall, but it did leave him badly injured. As treatment, she poured bleach over his wounds. and in 2003 of August, he died from the torture. Shelly hid his corpse in the freezer, telling his friends that he had gotten a job in Tacoma. David eventually buried him in their yard, but it was his disappearance that led now 14-year-old Tori to realize what was really happening in her home. Her older sisters had moved out by now, but when Tori told them what had happened, they urged her to gather his belongings so they could make their case to the authorities. Police investigated the property in 2003 and found Ron's buried body. David and Shelley were arrested on August 8th of that year. While Tori was placed in her sister Sammy's custody, David confessed to shooting Shane and burying Ron 5 months later. He was charged with second-degree murder for shooting Shane, and he served 13 years. Shelley was charged with second-degree murder and manslaughter for the deaths of Kathy and Ron. She was sentenced to 22 years. Her daughters were scared of what would happen when she was released. Nikki and Sammy live in Seattle and Tori moved to Colorado. In 2018, David was paroled and reached out to his daughters to ask for forgiveness. Sammy and Tori went on record to say, despite everything, they do forgive him as they consider him to be another one of their mother's victims. Nikki, however, did not forgive him. The abuse she suffered was unforgettable. Shockingly, Shelley only served about 18 years before she was released in November 22 at the age of 68. Since then, she has stayed hidden out of the limelight.